Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Irma Esparza-Diggs, and I am Senior Executive and Federal Advocacy Director at the National League of Cities. NLC is the voice of America's cities, towns, and villages, representing more than 200 Americans. And we work to strengthen local leadership, influence federal policy, and drive innovative solutions. Today, our state municipal league directors and presidents are here in our nation's capital to speak on behalf of local governments and their residents with both Congress and the administration. While we must strongly advocate for a debt deal to protect America's local economies, we must also not lose sight of the good Congress can do with bills that will improve the safety of thousands of American communities. Local governments are united in our support of the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act. We are here today to urge the Senate to pass this bipartisan rail safety legislation on behalf of all of our communities. And as you will hear from local leaders today, rail safety has been a growing concern for residents in communities of all sizes all across America. No community, not one single community, should have to worry that nothing has changed after the toxic derailment like we saw in East Palestine, Ohio. Communities have life and death issues with trains, from toxic derailments and children climbing over block trains or under them, to the Federal Railroad Administration not being able to act on the safety issues when we report them. Local governments deserve to be heard on this issue on behalf of their residents. And so today, you will hear from Deanna Dawson, CEO of the Association of Washington Cities. You will also hear from Mayor Jeff Silvestrini from Milk Creek, Utah, Mayor Deborah Van Meter from Gibbon, Nebraska, Commissioner William Harris from Fuquay-Varina, North Carolina, City Manager Pamela Polk from Collinsville, Oklahoma, and Village Administrator Maureen Murphy from Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin, and they will each come up after the Senator speaks. But to start us off, we have Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington, the great state of Washington, that other Washington, Chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, who is shepherding this important bipartisan bill through the Senate. Senator Cantwell, thank you for being a champion of rail safety of local governments. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Irma, and thank you to the National League of Cities for bringing us together today, and for all of you who do the hard work of advocating on behalf of cities and towns across this nation. I want to thank the leaders who are here who've traveled to Washington to show your support for this important legislation, and to reiterate that the people who are speaking today are all representatives of cities who have Class 1 railroads that travel through them. So they know how important this legislation is. A special thanks to the Mayor of Port Orchard, Washington, Rob Putasu, for coming to D.C. as well. We've been here on this important moment on rail safety, but it is now time to act. We have learned some hard lessons about derailments, environmental disasters, and the challenges that people in East Palestine still have to deal with today. I know that some of you probably watched these events unfold on television and thought, we're just like East Palestine. This could happen to us. The accident rates across America's rail network have increased 14% in just 5 years. In my home state of Washington, Class 1 derailments have nearly doubled in a decade. The Bipartisan Rail Safety Act is trying to prevent disasters like East Palestine from happening in any other town in America again. We took the lessons of East Palestine and turned them into legislation. We learned that you can improve the use of defect detectors that would have identified overheating in the wheel bearings and prevented a derailment. Under this legislation passed by the Senate Commerce Committee, railroads will use these defect detectors more frequently, and for the first time, the defect detectors will be used as a requirement and not just voluntary. A week ago, Norfolk Southern train derailed in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and once again, an overheated bearing was the suspected cause. These types of accidents will keep happening unless we do something to make rail safety improvements. We learned that not enough trains carrying hazardous materials are treated with the care that needs to be there for our communities. Under this legislation, more trains will be subject to stringent safety requirements. This will include trains carrying the vinyl chloride gas, which exploded in East Palestine. Many communities told us they didn't even know what hazardous material was being carried on trains through their towns. This legislation requires that railroads share that information with states. Before, they just had to share information about crude oil. Now they have to share information about all hazardous materials. Local firefighters told us that they needed better equipment to fight hazardous explosions. This bill would make more money available to those brave first responders out of an existing program and resources. This legislation would implement other important safety measures. Most importantly, though, it would also make sure that these rules are adhered to. This legislation increases the maximum fine for violating rail safety laws from $100,000 to $10 million, something that we think will be a more meaningful penalty for the risk and danger that might ensue if you do not follow the rules. To those of you from the rail towns like Mill Creek, Utah, Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin, Gibbon, Nebraska, and those in my home state, places like Pasco or Yakima or Spokane, Bellingham, and Vancouver, your town needs to know what's being transported through your communities. We need to make sure that we're doing our best here to make you safe. It is only fair that we come together as a country and make common sense rail safety laws that are important to keeping our community safe. These are not red towns, blue towns. They are towns in which the mayors have decided that it's time that we give America more rail safety. And I want to thank Senators Brown and Vance for their legislation and encourage all my colleagues to come out and support this legislation on the floor of the Senate so that we can get this to the House and on to the President's desk. Now I'll turn it over to another great friend from Washington State, Deanna Dawson. Deanna?
Thank you, Senator. I'm Deanna Dawson. I'm the CEO of the Association of Washington Cities, and I'm also a former city council member in the city of Edmonds, Washington, the home of our great Senator Maria Cantwell. And we know so well in the city of Edmonds how important this issue is. We have trains that run right through the downtown of Edmonds, right along the Puget Sound. And the safety of our community is really dependent on this type of legislation. So we're so fortunate to have Senator Cantwell, who really gets these issues, pushing this forward in the Senate. This is bipartisan legislation. This is so important because as I travel all across Washington State in my current role, I talk to people in the Kent Valley, south of Seattle. I talk to people in the Yakima Valley in central Washington. I talk to people in Spokane Valley in eastern Washington. And for all those communities and all the communities in between, I hear that this is a top priority, the concerns that they have, because they know this is real. We've seen these types of derailments happen in Washington State. Most recently in March, near the city of Anacortes, we had a major derailment that dumped over 3,000 gallons of fuel just on the Swinomish tribal lands right by the Puget Sound. This is a tremendous emergency in our communities. And we have these types of trains running through our downtowns, running along Puget Sound. We have them running through the playgrounds, right next to the playground that my son, we held his 4th birthday party at. This is a safety issue for our kids. This is a safety issue for all of our communities. And I urge our members of the Senate to join Senator Cantwell and others in passing this bipartisan legislation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Silvestrini. I'm the mayor of Mill Creek, Utah. I'm also the president of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. You know, Utah has a rich rail history, and we recognize the benefits of rail transportation. We are actually the crossroads of the West, and the place where the Golden Spike was placed on the Transcontinental Railroad when it was united. So we recognize the benefit of that, but our residents are threatened just as those across the country by threats of derailments and inconvenience and safety concerns with respect to block crossings in our communities, and we are concerned about that. And I want to thank the good senator, and also I want to thank Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, who is a co-sponsor of this legislation, reflecting its bipartisan nature. You know, we have a saying across our country, I think, about the folks that live on the other side of the tracks. Why is that? It's because a lot of our less advantaged residents are really forced by virtue of housing prices to live right next to rail lines. And they're the ones that are the least advantaged and the most threatened by the economic detriment of not being able to get to work on time because a rail crossing is blocked. But they're also at risk of a derailment and a toxic spill in their neighborhood. So this is why this legislation is so important. And I want to thank you, Senator, for your efforts. I hope that this legislation moves through Congress expeditiously. This is something that every city in America needs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Deb Van Meter, Mayor of Gibbon, Nebraska, and also President of the Nebraska League of Municipalities. As with Utah, the railroad industry is important to our state, but also railroad safety is important to all of our citizens. It seems like in the last few years we've seen an increase in train derailments. In fact, just 2 years ago we had one in my community of Gibbon. Fortunately, there was just limited damage to some of our city infrastructure, which was not completely reimbursed for our city. But there were no injuries or it wasn't a toxic spill. However, we do have, as do most of the cities in Nebraska, volunteer fire departments. And so the access to additional funds for training is really important for us for that. And so we do encourage and hope that this bipartisan legislation does pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Very nice to meet you.
You too. Thank you.
Excuse me. Hello, I'm William Harris, Commissioner from the town of Fuquay-Varina. Senator, good evening. Yes. I'd like to acknowledge the senators and my colleagues from throughout the country. It's a pleasure being here. When I grew up, the railroad track was less than a football field from my house. And then when I went to visit my cousin, it was closer than that. It was less than 25 yards. But we were fascinated with the railroads. We would count the cars. We would count the number of cars, and we would sit there and dream about how the cars would move, and eventually one day they would take us beyond where we were. And so the railroad and the railway was part of my life. Now, Fuquay-Varina is located in the central part of North Carolina, small rural town. When I was coming up, we used the railway to transport tobacco. It was a tobacco town. And so the railway was important to us. The fascination of the railway was communicated among us as children. But it's sad to say that fascination has gone away over the recent events that have occurred. What I know now that there are over 32 derailments in North Carolina, and they have been since 2018. That's an alarming fact for us. One of the things that exists in Fuquay-Varina now is that the railway is predominant in the major intersections in Fuquay-Varina. It's also located close to towns, schools where citizens walk, students walk in the afternoon. So our concern here now today is the safety of what has been an institution in the country. But that safety now comes to question because of the recent events. One of the things that we want in our community is the railroad companies to improve their signaling, to make sure that the signals and the warnings are clear, as well as to improve grading acknowledgement when there are systems where we want to improve local grading, as well as now the most important thing is to improve the communication with the railway companies. That communication is so important now. I think we are at a new crossroads in America in regards to the role of the railroads here in our country. It's no longer a fascination. It's now we're at the point where we have to do something to improve those relationships, to make sure that the railroad understands its role in still building America, but also building a safe America and having safe communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Pamela Polk. I am the city manager in Collinsville, Oklahoma, and also the president of the Oklahoma Municipal League. And as a city manager and all of my colleagues here today and across the nation, we are tasked with the responsibility of providing and building safe and healthy communities for our citizens. At present, there are too many roadblocks to do that. This legislation will change that and point us in the right direction. Senator Cantwell, thank you for that. Oklahoma is the crossroads of the nation. We have many of our cities and towns that have rail. One I do want to tell you about today is Claremore, Oklahoma. I spoke with their city manager earlier. In any 24-hour period, they have about 40 trains a day from 2 main lines through their town that interconnect and cross each other. They have about 17 grade crossings for traffic, 3 of those which go over state highways. When they do stop in town, the town is completely gridlocked and they're unable to move anywhere. He did tell me today that people have literally died in ambulances waiting to get somewhere. So, Senator, thank you for this legislation, and I urge all of us to get on board with this act. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maureen Murphy, and I'm the president of the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, and I'm here to thank Senator Baldwin, Senator Tammy Baldwin, for co-sponsoring this legislation. In Wisconsin, southwestern Wisconsin, we've had a very scary event happen last month. A train derailed right along the Mississippi River and placed 2 train cars with hazardous material right into the Mississippi River. So this becomes an issue for the safety of all of our water. Think about that. Anyone living near a railroad track. I live in the southeastern part of Wisconsin, and I picked the location for my home because it is near an Amtrak station. We have 2 major railroads in Wisconsin that run through the community that I serve, the village of Mount Pleasant, Union Pacific and Canadian Pacific. They run on the same rail that the Amtrak cars do. Imagine what would happen. How many of us take those commuter rail trains? Imagine what would happen to your ability to get to work on a daily basis. So I'm here on behalf of the Wisconsin League of Wisconsin Municipalities to thank the senator and to thank Senator Baldwin in hopes that this passes Congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Any questions for any of the people who've made remarks? Okay. Oh, yes.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead and identify yourself.
I cover Ohio.
Okay.
So I'm following this. Right now, any update on timing for when the full Senate might vote on this bill? And then past that, assuming it passes, are you worried about the bill's fate in the House?
I'm not worried when I see the people behind me because these are the people that have to deal with this issue and know it intimately. They live in these communities. And the thing that I think I've heard for every one of them, I'm just amazed at how much they're like the experience I'm having in my state, is that the volume of rail traffic has increased greatly. And because of that, these problems have become more severe. So I think what we have to do when we get to the House, I don't know, where our House colleagues are going to be, but I think we have to communicate the same thing you just heard from people here, that the railroads are important to us, they're important in getting product, but we could use a little more safety, a little more transparency, and I think people will support that. Yes?
Ryan, with Gray TV, we have a small corner of Washington in our Portland, Oregon market. Can you explain briefly just how antiquated or how unsubstantial the requirements are now for
Well, we listened to what the witnesses who testified before the committee said, but for the state of Washington, trains come in Spokane, they go down through the gorge, they go through practically every major city in our state, and then up and maybe up to refineries. So oil has been something that we've had a little bit of transparency on, but something like vinyl chloride showed the exposure that a community could have, and they don't even know that it's on a train. So first responders can't plan for it. The governor of the state doesn't even know. So we're first and foremost making that hazardous materials, which before was voluntary to disclose, have to be disclosed in a process so that towns can plan. And we had a derailment not too long ago that was in the Columbia River Gorge, a very hard place to get to. And people who are first responders need to know what they're dealing with in these areas. Secondly, instead of saying it's voluntary about these detectors, we're now seeing the heating and failure of these wheel bearings. We need to have information that would give us some sense in detectors more frequently than are being deployed voluntarily. So this legislation makes those detectors mandatory in a process that we think will be very helpful. And then third, it gives some resources to the local firefighters that don't have that kind of equipment access to then plan with their governor what kind of things they might want to have in their communities so that they're not left, without any way to respond. When you think about the communities that tested, that came up and gave some examples, most of these people, they might have paid fire departments, but some of them might have voluntary fire departments. So they need some help and support if this kind of product's going to be moving through their area. So those are the three things that we think are most important. Yes. Yes.
Jonathan Slant, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We've got about 3 dozen local lawmakers, local officials here. Are you guys calling your senators, your House members,
Yes.
what are you doing to try to get this through?
Anybody want to come up?
Anybody want to come up? Yep. Go ahead.
I'm from Pennsylvania. John Brenner from the Pennsylvania Municipal League. Both of our United States senators are on board for this legislation. And frankly, this whole thing is real simple for all of us to understand. And thank you, Senator. It's real simple. 3 reasons why we're doing this. Safety, safety, safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Would be willing to support this possibly if it added liquefied natural gas on the trains. I know that you don't like that idea, but if that's what it takes to get the 60 votes to get out of the Senate, if that's what it takes to get out of the House, what's your thoughts on sort of
Do you guys think that a safety bill, you should put more hazardous material on the trains? Or would you rather get the... I think right now we have to focus on the fact that there are gaps in transparency and technology that would make the rails safer. So I'm always, willing to listen to all our colleagues, and there were some amendments drafted but not offered. And so I think where we are is this is an important technology implementation on the detectors, and frankly trying to also expedite, I didn't mention it because we've had a lot of discussion about it in the past, but trying to get a faster implementation of rail car improvements in and of themselves. And I like sending that signal as fast as we can send it. If we wait another 1.5 years to send that signal, of why we need better rail cars in addition to the detectors, we're just wasting time. So we've seen a frequency. Let's get this done. We certainly can discuss any other ideas people want to discuss in the future. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you all.